this is Harsh Rules. I'm Ben Harsh, and today we're going to continue to learn to play the Band of Brothers series, or Bob as we like to call it, with Part 3, Artillery, Planes, and Special Rules. In Bob, it can be easy to confuse artillery pieces with guns. But artillery pieces are actually off-board units that can be called in for an artillery strike. If an artillery strike is available, it will be identified in the scenario card. For example, in scenario 20, the bloody triangle, you can find it here. Each scenario will outline the artillery's proficiency and accuracy. These are not always the same between scenarios, even if the unit is the same. So, once you know that you can call in an artillery strike in your scenario, just be aware that it costs 3 orders on the operations range. The other attribute you need to be aware of is the attack ratings. The number before the slash is the attack rating against vehicles. The number after the slash is the attack rating against infantry. Okay, so let's call in an artillery strike and I'll show you how this works. First, your spotting unit must have line of sight to the target. Your spotter must also not be engaged in melee. Once your spotter has a clear line of sight, they will radio in for artillery support. You will then be required to make a proficiency check. For this scenario, the proficiency is 8, so you need to roll an 8 or less to make the check. Be aware that there are modifiers to proficiency. So if you have formally declared op fire, you get a +1. If you're an American conducting op fire, it's -2. If it's German conducting op fire, it's -3. And Russians conducting op fire is -5. If you fail the proficiency check, you need to mark the artillery support piece as used and you cannot fire again this turn. If you pass the proficiency check, then you successfully called in fire and it's time to move to the next stage. Now that the artillery shell is incoming, let's see where it's going to hit. We do this by rolling an accuracy check. According to the scenario card, our accuracy is 8, so we need to roll an 8 or less to be on target. However, for every roll above our accuracy, we will experience drift. So if you roll a 9 in this example, it will drift 1 hex. If you roll a 10, it will drift 2 hexes. If your shot drifts, roll a 6-sided dice to determine which direction. Once you've determined where the shell hits, you can move to the next stage. When an artillery shell lands, it affects not only the target hex, but the 6 surrounding hexes as well. Artillery can launch 2 types of shells. The standard armament is high explosives. In some scenarios, you will have access to smoke. When impacted by smoke, any infantry fire gets a -1 modifier to firepower. And any unit moving within these affected hexes is not considered in open ground. Smoke also affects proficiency checks for vehicles and guns firing through the smoke. And SATW checks are also modified with a -1. Now let's go back to explosives and see what kind of damage we've caused to the targets. As stated earlier, the blast is going to affect not only the impacted hex, but the surrounding hexes as well. Therefore, we need to resolve the fate of a squad, a tank, and a loaded transport. When determining the squad's fate, you use the normal process for squad combat. The artillery's firepower against squads is an 8, so we move our targeting up to 8. When you review the squad's casualty ratings, you can see that 8, 7, 6, and 5 are suppression because The first casualty rating is 4. 4, 3, and 2 are double suppression plus reduction. And 1 is elimination because the second rating is a 7. Now with vehicles it's a little different. So the attack rating against vehicles is a 1. You do not count armor, but there are modifiers. So if it's open-topped, there's a +1 to the firepower, and if the armor is greater than 3, it's a -1. Now the transport is loaded, but since this is artillery, it targets just the transport itself. So you're going to resolve the fate of the transport and the crew via this roll. Since the transport is open-topped, we advance the firepower of our artillery strike to 2. So finally, you will roll for each of these instances and resolve the fates of these units, and that completes our artillery support training. Let's look at the attributes for planes, in this case the Stuka, and the Ju-87G. Much like artillery, planes are off-board units that are called in to attack specific targets. For attack ratings, the number before the slash is for vehicles, and the number after the slash is against infantry. The Stuka also has a proficiency rating, in this case a 6, which will become really important here in just a moment. The other important thing to remember is that whether successful or not, the Stuka has an order cost of 3. The Ju-87G has many of the same attributes as the standard Stuka. The main differences are the Ju-87G must select a vehicle, and they have no concealment or morale effects on infantry. On the plus side, the Ju-87G is available the next turn after an attack, unless you roll a 9 or a 10, which means you're out of ammo. You can use a Ju-87G multiple times per game, and you can use multiple Ju-87G units per turn. This has a different level of flexibility than the classic Stuka, which can select any target and gets concealment and morale effects on infantry, but you can only use 1 unit per turn per game. Okay, so let's look at how planes actually work in Bob. We're only allowed 1 Stuka attack per turn, so we pay our order cost of 3 and proceed with the attack. The first part of the attack I like to call the spotting phase. First, we need to declare a target. We cannot select a target that has woods or is currently involved in melee. So looking at our example here, let's eliminate those from the list. So we are going to select the hex with 2 units in it. Now, both units are concealed and we're not allowed to look. We need to select one of those units that we will actually attack. So let's choose the unit on the left. To determine if we successfully spotted the target, we need to run a proficiency check. The proficiency for our Stuka is 6, so we need to roll a 6 or less to spot the target. Now, if you miss your proficiency check by 1, then your opponent gets to select a new target within 5 hexes. Obviously, your opponent will choose any friendly target nearby that your plane will strafe. But if there is no enemy target, then they must choose another one of their own targets. If there are no other eligible targets, then you return to base, your unit is marked as used, and you lose your 3 orders. If you roll an 8, 9, or 10 in this example, then no target is spotted at all, and you return to base. For the purpose of this demonstration, let's say that we make our check and it's time to proceed to the next phase, so we begin our attack run. The first step of the attack run is that we're going to remove all concealed markers from that hex. So we're going to see finally what's underneath those markers. If you uncover any decoys, then those are also removed. Now that we're in range and we've removed all the conceal markers from that hex, we can see that our target is a T-34 tank. The unique thing about planes is that the other units are also affected if they're infantry. If they're infantry, they receive automatically, whether they're selected or not, one level of suppression. This is a tank, so we use the number before the slash, which is a 7. This is our firepower. There are modifiers to consider. If the vehicle is open top, there's a +1 to the firepower. If the armor is greater than 3, there's a -1. In this case, the armor of this particular tank is greater than 3, so there's a -1 modifier. Finally, we would roll the dice, and if we roll a 6 or less, then the unit is destroyed. Night operations can be one of the most challenging rule sets in Bob. The visibility and night rules are dependent upon the phase of the moon and the amount of cloud cover, and this will be outlined in the scenario as to how great your night visibility is. In this example, I've used 3 hexes. During night missions, increased movement costs are in effect because it's hard to see. Infantry pay an additional 1.5 movement points per hex, and vehicles spend an extra 2 movement points per hex. Reduced visibility greatly impacts the firing range, so infantry are restricted to normal range only, and vehicles have a max range of 10 hexes. Open ground modifiers are also reduced. At a range of 1, open ground modifiers +2. At a range of 2 hexes, +1. At 3 or greater, there is no benefit. Vehicle proficiency checks are also modified with a -1 per hex, up to a range of -4. Once outside visibility range, there's a loss of line of sight. This affects fire attacks, concealment, whether you're losing or gaining concealment, or route paths. Some scenarios may give the player a number of illumination rounds. These are one-time use counters that may be placed anywhere on the board at a cost of 1 against the player's op range. When used, all units in the same hex as well as adjacent to the illumination round are considered illuminated. This illumination lasts until it is removed during the recovery phase. Okay, let's look at some additional night rules. Gun flashes. Whenever an unilluminated unit fires, it can be immediately fired upon by one unused unit out of visibility range. And what happens when that unit is also in an unilluminated hex and opens fire? That's right, it sets up a chain. This interruption can continue indefinitely. If a unit is spotting for artillery or mortars, they may only spot targets within the visibility range. An unused concealed unit may be used to regenerate a previously concealed decoy. The following are special optional rules. These are advanced rules to add even more depth to the gameplay. Let's talk about the national differences in Bob. If you're a Russian or a German fighting each other, and the scenario takes place after 1942, you get a +1 to your morale during rout. American units have 2 differences. Reluctance is in effect for all units with a small r. What this means is that non-elite units receiving suppression immediately end their move. The second difference for American units is American melee. You can find this attribute as a subscript next to the firepower ratings. American melee is typically 1 greater than the normal firepower. The first optional rule is reverse movement. To use reverse movement, you must not have moved forward at all during the same turn. And movement cost of entering the hex behind you is multiplied times 4. The cost to change facing within the hex after that remains the same. Okay, let's look at the exciting drama of the unconfirmed kill. An unconfirmed kill can occur when a vehicle is attacked by an SATW squad, a gun crew, artillery, tanks or other armed vehicles, but not transports. The trigger for an unconfirmed kill is if the attack is exactly what is needed or one above. For instance, on our vehicle attack, if we needed an 8, we rolled an 8 or a 9. We would mark that vehicle with an unconfirmed kill marker. Now this vehicle just sits there with the marker and we don't know whether we've killed it or not until the next turn when the player tries to use it again. Then you need to roll a 10-sided dice and see what happened. If you roll a 1 through 5, the vehicle is destroyed. If you roll a 6 through 10, the vehicle survives. You remove the unconfirmed kill marker and proceed as normal. If this occurs while the vehicle is conducting op fire or final op fire, the vehicle halts immediately and is marked as used. In certain scenarios, there are special rules that designate certain hexes as having mines. The first time a vehicle enters a mined hex, and every 5th turn they remain in that hex thereafter, they need to make a roll. If a tank rolls a 1, they receive an unconfirmed kill marker. If a transport rolls a 1, it is destroyed, and if it's carrying any crew, they're killed as well. If infantry enter a mined hex, they get a plus 1.5 movement point penalty, and they continue to receive that penalty for every mined hex they move into. Now, if you run into a hex that is designated as concentrated mines, then it's a little more difficult. Vehicles and transports are now affected if they roll a 1 or a 2. When infantry enter a concentrated mine hex, they get the 1.5 movement point penalty plus 1 level of suppression. Jim's notes in the rulebook read, "Mines in World War II did not cause a lot of casualties. They did, however, slow movement greatly. Their purpose was more to channel attacks and or keep the enemy in the open longer to be killed by defensive fire. This rule is meant to represent that in a very simple fashion," and I think it does. Flank rules add the similar attributes of vehicles to infantry units. Flank rules do not apply when the unit is moving, routing, in a half-track, or concealed. Infantry units have 2 front hexes and 4 flank hexes. Facing rules now become very important, so infantry units can only fire through the 2 front hexes. When a unit that is not mortars or artillery fires at a squad or weapon teams through one of these flank hexes, that firepower of the firing unit is increased by 1. When a unit enters melee through any of the flank hexes, you mark that unit with a flank marker, and that unit receives a +1 to its firepower. A quick note, if there are 2 enemy units in the hex, the flank counter is only earned if entering through a flank hex of both units. Sustained fire. An unused machine gun weapons team may choose to use sustained fire when firing. To conduct sustained fire, place a sustained fire marker on the weapons team as well as a used marker. Also place a sustained fire counter in the target hex and in one additional hex. The additional hex chosen must be adjacent to the original target hex. The machine gun may final op-fire at all units that enter either of the target hexes marked with a sustained fire counter. However, it may no longer final op-fire in hexes adjacent to itself, unless that is where you put the sustained fire markers. You may also not use a command point to final op-fire at any target while in this condition. The sustained fire counters are removed at the end of the operations phase. The counters are also removed if a unit enters melee with the machine gun weapons team or it's eliminated. Combat events. Essentially, whenever a 1 is rolled when firing on the enemy, you also roll a 10-sided dice and complete an additional combat event. These additional random events create additional challenges throughout the mission. For example, if you roll a 1, infantry, the rolling unit, or the unit under fire is reduced. If it's a vehicle, it can receive an unconfirmed kill counters. Mark counters is used, and basically change up the game. And that wraps up this edition of Harsh Rules. I thank you for watching, and I'll see you on the next episode.